Hey everyone, it's Janome Man, aka Michael Smith. Now, some of you know me as the social quilter, and some of you know me as, yes, Janome Man from our Janome Life blogs and some of our Janome Canada videos. But I'm also the National Consumer Education Manager of Janome Canada, and I'm thrilled to be with you to continue the sewing of our fabulous Patterns for Pirates pajama pants, walk the plank pajama pants. That is a great project no matter what your skill level and no matter what your machine that you have, you can do this pattern. Now, hopefully that you've already watched the preparation video that I did about how to put your pattern all together and how to prepare and cut out your fabric. If not, you can stop this video, go back and watch the prep video, and then resume this class whenever you wish. You know, there's no pressure to finish this class at any time. It's entirely up to you. Certainly you can sew along with me, or you can watch the class and then resume at another time whenever is comfortable for you. That's ultimately how I learned to quilt. 30 years ago, I watched Eleanor Burns from Quilt in a Day on PBS with my VHS tape. I recorded her show. She did step one. I paused it. I did step one. Then I resumed. She did step two. Then I paused it and I did step two. So that's how I learned how to piece and quilt. So you can do the same with your pajama pants class as well. So you get to sew entirely at your leisure. These are such a fun, easy project to do. I know you're going to want to do many, and a perfect gift for the holidays. Now, everything is included in your pattern here. The Walk the Planks pajama patterns, given it's a unisex pattern, so men's and women. There's even an optional youth pattern as well. So go to the Walk the Planks patterns on the Patterns for Pirates website. Now, all the information again is in your pattern as far as how to put your patterns together, and some tips on how to measure and how to do any alterations you need to do for your pattern. That's all built in there, so you can go and watch all of their videos, their blogs. There's even a separate Patterns for Pirates Facebook group that you can join as well. So you'll get lots of information there. And again, make sure to watch the prep video, how to get all your fabric ready and cut out. So now we're ready to sew. Now, full instructions, sewing instructions are also included as well. But again, you can refer back to your written instructions and then also watch the step-by-steps that I'm going to do here. So that's all included. So that's great. Now, this little sample that I have down here, one of the options, if you are a 3 extra large and if you need to seam your fabric here, you know, our quilting cotton included, our fabulous peppermint fabric from Figo Fabrics, you know, that is about 44 inches wide. So if you're a 3X, that fabric is not wide enough, so you'll need to seam it. Now, it's okay that your pattern is going to be printed with that side seam. So again, full instructions there. If you have a wider fabric that you purchase additionally, about 54 inches wide, then you won't need to do this seam. But again, using your peppermint fabric there, then yes, you'll need to seam if you're 3 extra large. So here, this is an example of some of the seaming we can do, again, depending on what kind of machines that we have. This is a traditional seam. We're using 1/2 inch seam allowances, regardless of what machine we're using. So this is sewn traditionally, that it is sewn on the sewing machine at 1/2 inch, and then each of my seam allowances here are finished on the serger. And again, it doesn't matter what serger you may have. So you can sew the seam on the domestic sewing machine, and then you can finish your seams on the serger. Or another option is with your serger. Now, I love doing everything, again, quicker and easier than ever. Then here, this is a 4-thread serger, 4-thread serged seam. So on the sample here, I'm using 3 threads, that it's just finishing the edge as an overcast. But on this sample up here, I've actually constructed with the serger. So I have the 4 threads that make it stronger. Your 3-thread serger is not strong enough as a construction, so you definitely need your 4-thread serger using your left needle and right needle, as well as the upper and lower looper. So super simple, fast, easy to do, whichever kind of machine that you have. And if you don't have a serger, don't worry. I'm going to do this little sample now, and then I'm going to show you with another machine, a regular sewing machine, how you can finish your raw edges entirely on your domestic machine, so you don't have to worry about, oh no, I don't have a serger. Although again, it's an excellent addition to a sewing room. So with your 4-thread serger, regardless of what model, again, we're going to fold. This is our big pattern piece. Now, this is just my little shorts sample that also comes included in your Walk the Planks pajama pants. So you can either do full-on pajama pants to the floor. There's even an optional cuff, which we'll talk about later. Or then we could do it knee length, or this is the shorts length. Perfect for summer. So we're just going to simply match our back and front together here. Now I've got a little inseam here because of the shorts. If we were sewing our pajama pants, this inseam would be much longer. So on my shorts, we're just going to meet the the front and the back together, right sides, which is pretty sides together, matching the raw edges there. Now, when we're using our serger, I love to use these little clips, so then I don't have to worry about running over a pin with my knife blade. I made that mistake early on in sewing. So if we're using our serger, it's great that we can use, again, these little clips very safely. As we're approaching the knife blade that's in the serger, then again, we easily remove these clips. So we're sewing with 5/8, or we're sewing, sorry, at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Most of our garments are constructed with the 5/8 inch seam allowance, but remember, your written instructions in your pattern say to use 1/2 inch. So how you need to adjust your serger, again, consult your serger instruction manual to make sure that your left needle here is going to be 1/2 inch from that raw edge of the fabric. So again, consult your manual on how you adjust. Here I'm trimming off very little fabric, but that's the joy of the serger, that you're seaming and finishing off that raw edge and cutting off the excess all in one. So again, how simple is that? So those beautiful 4 threads, again, it prevents any raveling. So this is great. Then we don't have to worry when we're washing and drying, you know, no threads are going to ravel, and it's a very strong seam because we have the 2 needles, so nothing is going to come apart. Now, when we're going to just finish the seam allowance, we don't really need the 2 needles. We certainly could, that's totally fine, but typically when we're just doing the seaming to finish the seam allowances, we can remove that needle. And all I'm going to do is just trim that left needle thread and remove my left needle. I don't need to take the whole cone of thread away at all. So if we were going to finish our seam allowances and then sew on a regular domestic machine, we can just feed them in separately. Before I do any construction, I'm just going to go right along the edge. I'm really not going to trim at all. And in fact, again, consult your instruction manual. Maybe you want to disengage the knife blade entirely so you're not trimming off any fabric. We just want to trim or we just want to stitch so we finish off that raw edge. Now, when I come up here to my notch, this is the back notch, I'm going to end up trimming it off. But what I can do is, I'll just put a pin in my fabric here, away from my needle, away from my knife blade, and I'll put another pin in here. So 2 pins represent the double notch that I have here in the back of the fabric. So when we use the serger, we're going to end up trimming these notches off. So that's why I like to put the 2 little pins there, so I know that's the back when it comes time to construct this. So again, how simple, how easy is that? So I'm just finishing the raw edge, and then I will take this to the domestic machine, the regular sewing machine, and then sew that 1/2 inch seam allowance. So that's why we really don't want to trim off any excess when we're just finishing that seam. So if you have a serger, now is a great time to use it. But if you don't have a serger, then I'll show you the quick and easy techniques you can do to make your pajama pants. Now, no matter what sewing machine you may have, you can finish your walk the plank pattern for pirates pajama pants entirely on your sewing machine. Again, it does not matter the make and model at all. You can finish it entirely on your sewing machine. Now, depending on your machine, but probably you have these utility stitches of one kind or another. You may not have all of these, but for sure you all have a straight stitch. Most machines are able to do a zigzag stitch. So really, these are about the only 2 stitches that you need in order to finish your pajama pants. If your machine, perhaps one of these stitches here, these are overcast or over edge stitches. And again, always consult your machine's instruction manual, and they will tell you a little more about the stitches included in your machine, and then again, which ones are for which purpose. But if any of your machines have these kind of stitches here, that are utility stitches, again, for overcasting and over edging, then perfect. You have everything you need in order to finish your pajama pants. But again, we really only just need the straight stitch and zigzag. So I'm going to show you some options. This is one reason why I love this pattern, is there's so many great options to finish your pajamas. So here is a foot that comes with my machine. And again, check your machine's instruction manual and check your little accessory box. I'm using my fabulous Janome Continental M7 that comes with this M foot. That's one thing I love about Janome's, is their feet are all lettered, so it's easier to identify. So the M foot is an overcast or over edge foot that will help us finish that raw edge of the fabric. So we don't really need a serger. Great if you have a serger, but if you don't have one, this foot mimics that serger. There are these little wire prongs, as I call them, but they're basically stitch fingers like you would find on your serger. So with this M foot, this overcast foot or over edge foot, again, will mimic using a serger. It just won't trim your fabric. Now again, check your machine's instruction manual. Maybe you have a foot similar to that if you don't have a Janome machine. Now, many of our Janome machines come with that M foot, or it's also available in a separate blister pack as well. So the stitch that I'm using with my M foot to finish the raw edge is one of these, again, overcasting or over edge stitch. I have number 13, for example, or even number 14, even number 15. That's an extra heavy duty overcast stitch. So again, consult your instruction manual. You may have these stitches. They may not be the same number of stitches, but you may have the same stitches. Now I can also do a zigzag stitch to finish my raw edge as well. So again, we've got lots of options. So one option you can do when you have your fabric all cut out, then we're going to finish the edge of our inseam first, before we actually put the right sides together and sew the seam. We're going to finish this raw edge first. So I have my overcast stitch selected. Now, I don't know about you, but I like holding on to my thread tails, long thread tails. When I first started sewing about 30 years ago, that's what my sewing teacher instructed us. Hold on to your thread tails to get your seam started. And once you get started, then you can let go. So when you use this M foot in particular, or again, whatever kind of overcast or over edge foot you may have for your machine, and using one of those over edge or overcast stitches, you'll see if I sew really slow, I'll turn down my speed control, that the needle is going around these stitch fingers. So it's supporting my fabric without curling up the edge. So those little stitch fingers are there to help support the fabric and create the over edge stitch, which then looks, how beautiful is that? I've got this beautiful red thread so you can see. So using that M foot, or that overcast, that over edge foot, then you'll see I've got a row of straight stitching, and then I've got little peaks like a zigzag off the edge of the fabric. So then it completely covers that raw edge, so I can finish the seam allowances first before constructing the seam, so it's just a little easier to go around to finish those edge. So you can ultimately finish the seam allowances all around your garment piece. You don't want to finish off the very top edge here, though. That's where we're going to attach our elastic. So you don't want to finish that edge off, but you can finish off all the other edges of your fabric first before you construct it together. Another option we can do to finish off the raw edges of our fabric so they won't ravel is, again, just a plain zigzag stitch. So no matter which machine you have, almost all of them can do a zigzag stitch. So again, consult your instruction manual on how to set up your machine for a zigzag, but very, very simple. I'm just using the regular A foot that comes with my machine, the regular zigzag foot and the regular zigzag needle plate. So again, we don't need anything fancy at all. And I'm just going to run my zigzag stitch along the edge of the fabric. Now we're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I want that zigzag to be kept within the 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you decide where on your needle plate or what marking on your foot you may follow. Here I'm just following the edge of my fabric and doing a nice wide zigzag. And I can certainly speed up my machine. Ooh, look how quick and easy that is. So again, you don't have to spend a whole lot of time worrying and adjusting. Just any old zigzag will do. The nice thing about the zigzag stitches, I don't have to be right at the edge of the fabric. You decide if you want your zigzag right against the edge of the fabric, that's okay. I find a lot of times it's easier just if it's in a little bit from the edge. So I can either trim that edge down closer to my line of stitching, or I just leave it. So if this edge ravels a little bit more, well, it won't matter because that zigzag stitching is going to stop whatever raveling. So it's totally fine. So you decide, are you going to zigzag right to the edge of the fabric, or are you going to bring it in a little bit? I find it's easier when you bring it in a little bit because then you don't have to worry about the needle maybe punching your fabric down in the needle plate. So it's a super simple way to finish off the edge of your seams. Now we have the option, again, this is all about choice. So we have the option of either finishing off our seam allowances first, or we could actually construct our seam and then finish the seam allowance. So the order in which you do it is entirely up to you. So I've decided on this sample, I'm going to sew my 1/2 inch seam first of the inseam. So what we want to do is fold our leg pieces. We have 2, so we're going to fold them right sides together, which means the good sides together, and we're going to match up the inseam. So here's for my pajama pants, so it's a nice long seam. And then what I like to do is start sewing from the hem. Now, if you watch the prep video, then you remember then this is for the non-cuff option. So I have pressed up my 1 inch hem allowance that was allotted in our pattern. So I've created that memory hem, so it'll be easier when I actually finish this hem off that I've pressed it to hold it in place. But in order to sew my inseam, we want to unfold that hem. And then I like sewing from the hem to the crotch seam, because you definitely want your hem edges to match. If they're off a little bit in the crotch seam because it's a curve, you can just trim it off, it'll be okay. But in order so your pattern pieces finish off at the same size that they should, I love using these little clips. You can use clips or pins, whichever is easier for you. So match up all your edges and then clip them together or pin. And then we're going to sew with a regular straight stitch at 1/2 inch. Now maybe your foot, your presser foot can be your guide, or perhaps on your needle plate, as I have here on my Continental M7. Many of our Janome machines, it doesn't matter which model they are, many of them have marks on the needle plate. And again, maybe you have a non-Janome machine, that's okay too. Maybe your machine has a 1/2 inch mark on the needle plate, so you can use that as your guide. Now, some machines you're able to use this magnetic seam guide, so you could attach that to your needle plate up at 1/2 inch, so it's very accurate. So that's an option. Some people even put some masking tape or painter's tape down on their bed of their machine, again at that 1/2 inch mark, so then you've got that accurate seam. Now remember, especially if you're a beginner, don't stress about it at all. It's great to be consistent and to be accurate, but if your seam wobbles a little bit, that's okay too. These are very forgiving. So just using my regular straight stitch, it's always a good idea to either back stitch. If your machine has a little lock stitch, you could do that too, or just a regular back stitch, and then away we go. So I'm just sewing whatever speed you need. You don't have to sew a race here. Again, you're sewing by yourself, so you can sew as fast or as slow as you would like. So as I get up to my clips, I always like to remove them. Again, I'm trying to keep my fabric up against that 1/2 inch. Now, pins, if you are a pinner, and overall I'm not as much because I love these clips, but if you are a pinner, it's a really good idea. I like putting my pins in this way. So the tip of the pin is away from the needle. This is kind of the more traditional way of pinning. So then the pin is actually in your seam allowance. But then maybe you're going to run over that pin, which you definitely don't want to do. So, and then you got to stop and remove that pin. So I learned years ago, if I'm going to pin, I pin out like that. So then the tip of the pin isn't anywhere near my needle. I don't even have to remove those pins as I'm sewing. I can just go right up next to them, and then once I'm done sewing, then I can remove the pin. So it just makes it very accurate and very easy. Again, I like to kind of save time where I can, but again, there's no need to run a race with this. And then again, I would do my little back stitch, and away you go. So what you're going to do is sew each of these long inseams for your right leg and your left leg, and then you're going to flip one of them right sides out. So you'll stick your hand in all the way in the bottom, and then you will flip it right sides out and nest the one piece inside the other. And I have another sample to show you. So once you have your inseam finished, your seam is finished, your seam allowances are finished however you would like to finish them off, so they're not going to ravel, then again you're going to stick your hand in one leg and turn it right sides out. So you'll have one leg that is wrong side out, and then you're going to have another leg which is right side out. And again, you're going to be using that beautiful peppermint fabric from Figo. So these are just my test sample. As you're a beginner sewer especially, it's always good to do a test sample. You maybe don't want to use your beautiful new fabric, so instead buy some lesser expensive fabric, or if you've got a big stash at home, use that instead. So you're going to tuck one leg in the other, and this is where we're going to pay attention to those all-important notches that we talked about in our cutting and prep video. Here I see by this big notch that I know I have the back here. So I'm going to look and make sure that matched up to it, here is my one leg and here is my other leg. So I'm going to match my two big notches. And again, I love using these clips, but you can use pins. So I match my top edge up here, which is my waistline, and then I'm going to match this crotch seam here. So once you get your notch matched up, then we're going to come here to the inseam that we just sewed. Now your seam allowances would already be finished. To save time, I didn't finish mine just for demo purposes, but normally your seam allowances would be totally finished. So when I come here to this inseam, you see I've got one seam allowance from one leg and another seam allowance from another leg. That can be quite bulky. So to help to distribute the bulk a little, or, to make sure those seams match or kiss perfectly, I like to distribute that bulk. So one seam allowance is going to the left and the other seam allowance is going to the right. You don't have to do this, but I find I do this when I'm a quilter. If you're a quilter and a piecer, you'll understand this totally, that we're nesting those seams, or kissing them as they're sometimes called. So we're basically locking those seams, so then it distributes the bulk. So that's good. I clip that into place. Then I continue along my seam, and then, oh yes, here are those front notches. And I know it's the front because that's just a single notch. So we line up our notches there. And then again, we're going to match up all the way up here at the waist. Now, sometimes as I get towards the end, my pieces are matching perfectly. And in order to keep them matching perfectly, as a little tip, I like to take my clip, or if I had a pin, I would do the same thing, that I would like pin here, or actually I like to pin this way. So I just put another pin or a clip in the opposite, direction, kind of at 90 degrees, just to make sure that these edges stay perfectly matched. So I don't have to worry about anything shifting. So, and use as many pins and as many clips as you feel you need. Now, again, you choose, if you had finished your seam allowances separately first, this seam allowance would already be finished off, either by a serger or by our overcast stitch or our zigzag stitch. Instead, I'm going to sew my seam first at 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to finish that raw edge. So again, I'm just going to use my regular straight stitch, and I'll back stitch. Now, typically for most machines, your average stitch length is about a 2 or 2.4, 2.5, somewhere along that line. It doesn't need to be anything too small. Generally for quilters, for piecers, we're doing 1.8, so that's quite tight. But for this project, we can do it again, just a regular standard 2.5. So we would continue along, again, keeping our 1/2 inch seam allowance consistent. But again, if you're wobbling a little bit, it's no big deal. This really won't matter at all. As we get up to our inseam here, again, we can always remove our pin or our clip and just double check that, yes, is everything going to kiss and nest as we would like it. And definitely I want to help try to flatten those seam allowances. And then once I get past that inseam, then I can go in and refine to make sure my edges are aligned. But the nice thing with this 1/2 inch seam allowance, as we're going around our curve here for the crotch seam, we don't have to clip or grade our seam allowances. We're able to go around that curve, very easily. So there, as I'm coming up to my edge, remove my clips. And then again, you decide you want to do a little back stitch or a lock stitch. It's up to you. Now there. So then now I will go in and I'll finish off my seam allowance either with the zigzag stitch or with the overcast stitch. I can help things along. Now I no longer need these notches. So before I finish off my seam allowances, if I haven't already done so, I can go in and then just trim those notches off. And then here at the inseam, then I can just trim those extra little bits of fabric that are sticking out. So then when I go back to finish these seam allowances, that nothing will be in the way. I can do it quicker and easier that way. So there, we're almost done. Would you believe it? So simple. So once we finish that crotch seam, pull one leg outside the other, and now we're ready to put on our elastic. And as usual in your pattern, in your written instructions down here, then it lists the whole size chart depending on what size you are. I'm using medium, for example, so it says to cut my elastic at 30 inches. So isn't it wonderful that the elastic comes included in your little goodie box there? You know, there's so many different types of elastic out there. So some are really quite stretchy, that are more like sports elastic. So those are good, particularly, again, if you've got any kind of like sportswear or skating costumes, anything like that. They've got quite a lot of rubber in them. But some nicer elastic for your pajama pants and for your garments, they're known as knit elastic. So there's less rubber in them, and they're stretchy because of the knit. So again, how wonderful that you don't need to worry about which kind of elastic to get. It's already included in your goodie box. So that's wonderful. The only thing you'll have to do is, again, look on your pattern chart in your written pattern, but as well also on your paper pattern. When you print that out and tape it all together, it will tell you again what size to cut your elastic for whatever size of pajamas or shorts that you're making. So that's great. So here is my little sample that I've cut, and it's up to you, but you can either use a little extra piece of ribbon, or this is just some extra fabric, you know, that you have maybe left over from cutting your pajamas, that you're going to wrap around the edge of this elastic to join it. You know, in the old days, I've been sewing for about 30 years or so. In the old days, we actually folded our elastic together and sewed through both ends. And then we had this big seam allowance, which then we would sew down, and it was so bulky. Now, oh no, it's a very slimline way of attaching your elastic. And again, full instructions included in your pattern. But I take my little strip of fabric. Again, if you had some pretty ribbon or something, by all means use it. I just cut this little rectangle. It's 2 inches wide by 3.5 inches long, but those measurements are entirely up to you. I just found this worked good. So I'm going to butt the 2 ends of my elastic over my piece here, and again I've got the 3.5 inches this way and the 2 inches this way, and I'm just going to wrap it almost like a little present. So then I fold that up there, and I fold that up there. And again, if you want to use your pins or your clips or even a little bit of glue stick, that works too, just to hold that together, because now you're basically just going to zigzag this through. Now you could do regular straight stitching as well. Just if you're going to sew through the elastic with a straight stitch, I would definitely lengthen your stitch. You're going to want at least about a 3 or a 4 to again accommodate some of that stretch. But again, I'm just going to use my regular zigzag, and I'm just going to go through it a couple of times. You don't have to sew through it, you know, a million times. It's just enough to anchor it securely, so it's going to stay nice and flat. This join will put it at the back of the pajamas. So again, there's going to be nothing protruding out, nothing that's going to be uncomfortable, you know, bulging and sticking into you. So there, I'm done. I'm only just going to do those couple of stitches, and that way everything, if I trim up my threads, you know, everything stays neat and clean. There we go. So this is going to be entirely covered as well. No one's going to see this, so it really doesn't matter. But again, mainly it's just to keep the elastic nice and flat. And then, yes, I can still stretch. Nothing is going to come apart, so that's great. We're now going to quarter it and put it in our pajamas. So I already know the back is, again, with this little ribbon on it, or this piece of fabric. So I can still feel those edges are nested together, but I can still feel where that joint is. So I'm going to put a pin in there. Then, by folding it in half there, then I see, oh, this is now going to be the front. And I put a pin in there. Now I bring those two pins together, so then I can put a pin in one side. And then I'm going to put a pin in the other side. So super simple way. This is a, traditional way of putting an elastic, but it's just so simple, so easy to do. So once you have quartered your elastic, you're now going to flip your pajama pants so they're right side out. So finally you get to see the pretty side. Now, if you're looking at it and going, oh wow, maybe I made a mistake here. This piece way up here is sticking up. Well, that's entirely the way it should be. That this is going to be your back piece. Always on all of your trousers and leggings and everything, the back is always higher than the front. Think about it. It's got a bigger way to travel. And when you're sitting down, you don't want your pajamas, scooting down. So that's why the back piece is always higher than the front. So you haven't done anything wrong. In fact, if they're not like this, then maybe you've done something wrong, but this is totally fine. So you can totally tell which your back piece and your front piece is because you've got that crotch seam. So facing me is the back, and then towards you is the front here. Now, if you have finished your seam allowances separately, if you've either serged them separately or you finish them on the machine with that overcast stitch or that zigzag stitch, then you can open your seam allowances like this. If you did your seams on the serger where they're all serged together, then you'll have to decide, do you flip it to the left or to the right? But if you can open your seams, that's great because then they'll just lay a little bit more comfortably. So I'm going to take this as my back, again facing me, so then I know this is my back with that little piece of ribbon or fabric there. So I'm going to slip in the elastic inside my garment here and pin that in place. Then I will go and I want to, before I do that, I want to make sure I need to mark my side seam. So yes, we need to match the front and back crotch seam in order to, yes, first we need to put our pin in one side and pin in the other. You can tell I'm excited because I'm trying to go and finish these because they are so fun. Believe me, these are so addicted to make. You'll definitely want to make some for everybody. So yes, now that I marked my side seams, I take one pin and match to the other. And how many pins you ultimately put in or clips to put in is entirely up to you, whatever you feel you need to really secure your fabric. You want to match the cut edge of your pajama pants fabric to the finished edge of your elastic. So then I'm going to come around here to the front and again pin that in place. And again, you decide, do you want your seam allowances pressed open if you're able to do so, or just press to one side. Then I come up here to the other side seam and get that anchored. So now that I have my quarters pinned, you'll see that yes, once I stretch that elastic, this is going to fit that waistband. Now, it's a really important tip in your patterns, and again, make sure that you review your patterns and make sure that you review the tutorials that are included with your pattern on the Patterns for Pirates websites. They talk about exercising your elastic. So that is something that you definitely want to do to make sure that you've got that stretch to your elastic that you sort of help to relax it a little more. If you haven't already done so, then now you could even do it when it's pinned together. But it's a good idea to do it ahead of time, so it's a little bit more, again, relaxed before you cut it. So now that I have it in place, I'm going to go to the machine. And again, I'm just going to use a regular zigzag. Now you can use, this would be a great time if you have a serger, this would be a great time to use the serger to just attach the elastic here. But again, without a serger, it's totally fine. I'm actually going to make my stitch a little wider. And again, if you want to do the same, then you again consult your instruction manual on how to adjust your machine to make your zigzag a little wider. So now I stretch out my elastic and I think, oh, I could use maybe an extra pin or maybe an extra clip or two to help hold that edge of the pajama pants even with the edge of the elastic. And I can gently hold on at the back just to tug it out a little bit so it gets going. If you have needle down position to your machine, this is a great time to use it. So then your needle, when you stop sewing, your needle stays in the fabric. So it helps hold that fabric together. Now, another adjustment you can make in your machine, not only with the length, but also the width. So I think I'm going to just widen mine a little bit as well. This really doesn't need to be a very narrow zigzag. It can be quite wide because you're really only attaching the elastic onto the pajama pants, like just to hold it in place. And by having this zigzag stitch, is great because it has that built-in stretch. So it's going to allow your elastic to stretch and nothing is going to pop. And then again, by having it all pinned or clipped in place, then nothing is going to shift. You don't have to worry about your fabric gathering in one place more than the other. Now I am holding my fabric a little bit here at the back, but by no means am I pushing and pulling. You really need to be careful not to pull your fabric too much. You do want this elastic to be out taut, but you don't want to pull it too much because that can easily break your needle. So that's why you want to hold it out, but you're not really pulling on it. You're not really tugging on it. And I definitely want to remove my pins before I get to them. It is a very bad habit to do so with them in. Trust me, ask me how I know. So you'll see I'm doing this in real time. It really does not take that long to do. And here I'm coming right at the start. I can overlap my stitches a little bit. I can do a little back stitch if I need. Cut my threads, and boom, like how perfect is that? That is so cool, and it's so beautifully neat. Like, and the great thing is that, again, nothing is going to pop, nothing is going to, ravel. We're ultimately going to fold this now down and then do another line of stitching in order to hold this elastic down very neatly. So again, there's going to be no raveling. Everything's going to stay in place and it's going to be very comfortable to wear. Once we have the elastic all sewn to our pajama pants, it's time to fold it to the inside, and then we're going to top stitch it down. So on my sample here with that beautiful peppermint fabric by Dana Willard, then you can see when I stretch this out a little bit, I attached my elastic with my serger. Again, that's an option if you have it. So I attached the elastic with the serger and then I folded it down to the right side, and then I've got a very wide zigzag stitch in that darker color then that's actually holding the elastic down. So here on my right side, you can see it's actually a multi-step zigzag, or it's also called a tricot stitch. So perhaps your machine has that as well. Again, a regular zigzag, as I've been using so far, that's totally fine too. And you know, it doesn't even have to be a zigzag. If you do have a more advanced machine with some decorative stitches, then maybe you'll use the serpentine stitch, or maybe one of the other kind of open decorative stitches. You don't want to use anything tight or anything too fussy, because you do need that stretch. So just a regular zigzag, or again a tricot stitch or a serpentine stitch, something a little wavy line would be fine too, to hold that elastic down. So another cute little accent that you can add to your pajama pants is put in a little tag here at the back. Now again, when I hold up my pants, the back is always going to be a little taller than the front, but especially if you're giving these as a gift for somebody, then maybe you'd like to include that little tag at the back, so then they know for sure at a glance, here's the back. So it's a great way to use up some scraps. So in order to make that little tab for the back, I have another piece of fabric here that's 3.5 by 2 inches wide. You make it however you wish, or again, a great time to use a little bit of extra ribbon or something. By doing the fabric here, again, it's 3.5 by 2 inches. Then I'm just going to fold it into the middle, fold the raw edges into the middle like that, and then fold it over like that. So I have a fold on my right side and a fold here on my left. But then I'm just gonna take this to the machine. Again, very simple, very easy. This isn't really a big deal, but I thought it was a cute little extra touch and a great way to add a little designer detail. So I'm just gonna stitch down close to the edge of that fold on one side, and then just spin it around. And so close to the edge on the other side. Very simple and easy. So I like making a nice longer strip like this, and then you could leave a nice big tab like that if you wished. That's now going to be about an inch or so, but instead I will just cut this in half. So, oh look, for your next pajama pants, you already have another little tab. So how perfect is that? So this little tab now I'll fold in half. And then before I sew down the elastic, now that I have it attached, and then I'm going to fold it into the inside, before I stitch it down, I'm just going to, well, I'll take out my pin here. I'm just going to put it in between my layers, so then I'm going to catch it when I do my next row of stitching. To stitch down this elastic, I'm going to catch that little tab in the back. So it'll be a really cute little, again, designer detail. And if you're giving this, again, as a gift to someone, then they know for sure. And maybe if you're making multiple pajama pants for the same household, then by having, oh, maybe, you know, Billy has a red tab and Susie's got a pink tab or something like that. So then everybody knows which pants are theirs. So that's great. So when you fold this elastic now down, you want to, again, stretch out your elastic so it's nice and flat, like the fabric is nice and flat. So just do a little section at a time to fold your elastic down. Again, the fabric, we don't want any pleats or any gathers in the fabric, but we want it folded right along the edge. I can feel the edge of my elastic there. So we want to fold it right down to that edge, and then we'll definitely need a pin or two to hold it into place. So we go along, just do, again, a small section at a time to pin, to hold this down. Everything is nice and flat. Then you've got, again, some more options. Do you want to do just a straight stitch? Again, if you did, I would definitely lengthen your stitch so it's at least about a 3.5. So then you've got, again, some of that built-in stretch. If you've got a triple stitch on your machine, a triple stretch stitch, that's a great option too. Or again, I'm just going to use a regular old zigzag, again, that most of us have in our machine. So again, anybody can do this. Now our elastic is 1.5 inches wide. So again, you decide, is there maybe a seam guide that you attach to your machine? Maybe if you want to use, again, that magnetic pin holder that I used before, that magnetic seam guide, that you can attach that as well. Or again, do you need some painter's tape or something here to mark where your 1.5 inches is? I've got an 1.5 inch mark on my needle plate, but I'm going to back it off just a little bit because again, I want my zigzag to be on my elastic. So my elastic is 1.5 inches, but I'm going to back off my line just a little bit, and I can actually feel it underneath. So whatever kind of guide you need. Ooh, and then I need to return my machine back to a zigzag. And I'm going to increase the width. Now again, how wide it is up to you. I'm using a 5.0 width, but again, that's up to you. And I think I'll make a 3.0 a 3.0 width and a 5.0 length. But again, that's entirely up to you. And you, again, double check your instruction manual. So again, I'm going to gently guide my fabric at the back, but I really don't need to pull on it or tug on it. I just want to keep it flat. So as I do that zigzag, I am holding down the fabric and everything is again nice and flat and nice and secure. And you've got this beautiful line of zigzag. And again, you've got that built-in stretch. So how perfect is that? And then again, on the inside there, you'll see another line. Again, depending on the thread that you use to, match your fabric, that it can bury in there. Nobody will see it. But again, it's on the inside. So it doesn't matter if you see 2 rows of zigzag stitching. So that's totally fine. But on the front side, it looks very beautiful and it's nice and clean. On the inside, again, nothing is going to ravel, so it's all going to stay beautifully in place. So the next step, once you get your elastic all attached, we can go down here to the hem. Now, again, depending on how you finished your hem allowance, maybe it was on the serger, maybe it was with the overcast stitch, or maybe it was just with a plain zigzag. Another alternative to finish your hem edge, we have that memory hem. We've already pressed up our 1-inch hem, but another alternative to finish your hem would be to do what's known as a clean finish. So we take our hem and we're going to fold it up 1/2 inch, and then we're going to fold it up another 1/2 inch. And then there, that is our clean finish. So then the raw edges are completely covered. This is what you do, for your jeans. So the raw edges are completely covered, and then you could just do a straight line of top stitching to hold this in place. So that's an alternative for your hem. Now, when it comes here to your side seams, again, if they were finished separately, then this is where you can hold them open. And then as you fold up your 1/2 inch and then your other 1/2 inch, then those side seams are open, they're flat, so it won't be so bulky as you do that straight stitch. So that's an alternative, that clean finish. Or if you, again, have finished this edge on a serger or with the overcast foot, very simply, then you would just do a separate row of top stitching. So I'm going to switch back to my overcast foot here and go back to my overcast stitch. Now again, there's a number of options available depending on your machine, so consult your manual and decide which one is best. Or again, you could just use a regular zigzag. So how simple is that to do? We would just sew in the round, as it's called, because we're sewing around our hem. If you have a free arm from your machine, great time to use it. Take off your little accessory box and put the pant leg around your free arm to do that stitching, so that's great. Again, I don't have a free arm here in my Continental M7, but these are nice, generous size. The legs aren't too small, so I can easily fit them around, no problem. So again, once you finish off that hem edge, you're going to fold up your 1 inch hem allowance. This is where, again, having that built-in hem with your pressing definitely helps. But I'd still like to hold it in place, again, either with pins or with these clips. So once the hem allowance is all finished, I'm going to snap back. I love having a machine where I can switch out the presser feet really easily. So again, we've got options. We can use a regular straight stitch. We could even use a decorative stitch. We could use a zigzag stitch. It's entirely up to you what kind of a stitch you want to do. And again, use a mark on your needle plate or with your seam guide of exactly where you're going to do your stitching. I'm just going to slightly increase my stitch length. The usual is, again, about a 2.4, 2.5, but I wanted to go a little bit longer of a stitch, so I've got it at 3.0. So when you're doing your top stitching of your hem, you want to keep it fairly close to your line of stitching to hold it in place. So here you can see where my seam, where I started to overcast my seam, and then my line of stitching is basically continuing right along that straight stitch there. So then there is my line of stitching. Again, this hem allowance would be finished all the way around. But then there on my right side is just a straight line of stitching. Like, how beautiful is that? Everything is so neat and clean, and this can be thrown in the washing machine and dryer that nothing is going to ravel, and they're beautifully finished. So if you have used the serger to finish off your hem edge, then it's all nicely, beautifully finished inside. Nothing is going to ravel, and it's so easy to then do a nice, neat top stitch of your hem on the sewing machine, so everything stays in place, nothing is going to ravel. So this would be a hem alternative for you if you were doing the regular walk the plank pajama patterns with the standard fold up 1 inch hem. If you would like the optional cuff pattern and cuff alternative, that I will show you in just a minute. So you've got the choices again. This is your regular pajamas pattern, or now we'll talk about how simple and easy it is to put a cuff on your pajamas if you wish. If you would like to add this adorable little cuff, and again, have more fabric, who doesn't love more fabric, add another print, again, how fun is that? So if you would like to add this nice big wide cuff and this little accent band, think of this as piping without the filling. So if you would like to add this now, very easily done. Your regular walk the plank pajamas pattern has a regular 1 inch hem turned up, but we can also now add this optional cuff. And then yes, we have the pattern included, so that's wonderful. So I have already traced off my pattern pieces here from my master. So you'll see then the optional cuff, I'm going to have cut two, but it says on fold. So instead of having that fold of my fabric, what I like to do instead is actually fold my tissue paper and then cut it out, and then now I have the whole pattern pieces. So I could lay this pattern piece down on my fabric, and then I can layer it with right sides together and then cut two, so I don't have to refold my fabric. So that's great. So we need our big optional cuff, and then we've got this cute little 2 inch strip of piping. Now, instead of worrying about exactly how big this piping needs to be, there is the measurements on your pattern, but instead I figured just cut a strip of your 44 inch wide fabric, the big long length of fabric like this. So you don't need to then worry about cutting this optional piping to size right now. First, we're going to sew this onto our cuff, and then we can trim it later. So it just saves a little bit of time, and you don't need to stress about it. After you have cut out your pattern pieces for your cuff, then you're going to press your cuff, each cuff, in half, and then open them up, and then draw this 1-inch line on one side with a very faint marking pencil, whatever you want to use, and then take this to the ironing board and press this edge up 1/2 inch, and you've got that mark as a guide, so this edge is nice and straight. Then we're ready to take our big long piece of piping here, again with no filling, and we're also going to fold this strip in half, take that to the iron and press so we get that crease in there, that built-in memory, which then, boom, we have here. So isn't that great? So then we're going to open that piping strip up again and match the right side, again the pretty side. One side is going to go to this raw edge of the cuff. And again, because we've cut a nice big long strip, we don't need to worry about matching up the edges. So again, we could use our pins or our clips to hold that in place. So we're going to sew along with 1/2 inch seam allowance, attaching our piping onto our cuff. So just with a regular straight stitch on your machine, and again, you either have a mark on your needle plate or you have with your seam guide something that you attach to help you get that accurate 1/2 inch seam. So we're going to do this twice because we've got 2 cuffs and 2 piping strips for 2 legs. And it's a really cute detail to add, and this is something Patterns for Pirates did just for us, this optional cuff. It's really cute. So there, that is my piece, and then now with my scissors or rotary cutter, then we can cut off that piping strip in line with our cuff. Now that you have your piping strip cut to the dimensions of your cuff, it's very easy to then fold the two, you want to fold it out, and the 2 short edges together. Now you're going to press your seam of your piping that you just attached, you're going to press that with the seam allowances up. So this piping strip can then press over, and ultimately it's going to wrap over your seam allowance. And how we had this with that fold line earlier, and again those seam allowances now meet that fold line. So this will eventually fold down, that piping will completely seal that seam allowance, so everything will stay nicely finished. And if you remember, the first step that we did after we pressed our center seam is that we folded down the opposite edge 1/2 inch and pressed that. So now again we can open up all those folds and match the short edges together. Now this is where, again, our seam allowances, we want them to match. Now we could, as I often do, just turn one down so it's facing in the opposite direction. So they're nesting. So one seam allowance will go down and the other will go up. That's always an option. But for these cuffs, I actually prefer not to. So everything stays just a little flatter around your ankle. So I fold them back so I can see that, oh yes, they're really going to match together. And then again with my clips or my pins to hold them in place. Now because we're just using cotton fabric, again, that really isn't that bulky of a seam allowance, but you'll want to go maybe a little slower. Again, I always like to start sewing with long thread tails that'll help pull through that bulk. So on this opposite edge that we again had folded down 1/2 inch, we want to open that up, make sure those folds match, and then those raw edges match so we can sew down with 1/2 of an inch. So everything will be neatly finished, no raw edges. So this is again 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. So very simple to do. The nice thing is we don't have to worry about finishing these raw edges of this seam because they're all going to be encased. Now again, you decide you want to back stitch or do you want to lock stitch, it's entirely up to you. So there, once we have that done. Now to make this really nice and flat, we can open that seam allowance there. Now a helpful tool to have in your sewing room, something I've had for many years. Oh, you can see some wear and tear. It happens to us all. This is a sleeve board, and it actually is very handy. It's not necessary, but it really is handy for this step. If you would like to, then again, press these seam allowances open. You can wrap your cuff around that sleeve board, and it just makes it a little easier. And then I can press this 1/2 of an inch over again. It just makes it really easy. So I would take this to the ironing board, press those seam allowances open so they just lay nice and flat when you fold your cuff. After you have the seam pressed, so everything is nice and flat, then you're going to flip back your cuff. Oh, you could even take it off the sleeve board to make it a little easier. You're going to flip back your cuff again along that center fold that you first pressed, and there you see our cuff forming. This fold is going to be around the hem of the pants, and then this edge with your piping contrast is going to, again, that's going to fold under. So everything is going to be nicely finished on the right side, the good side that's going to show with this piping edge. And then here on the inside that we folded under earlier, again, that's going to be all nicely finished, no raw edge. And then everything is going to be stitched down with a top stitch. You could use a straight stitch, or again, I chose to use a decorative stitch. That was a little easier to do. I didn't have to worry about, oh, if maybe my line of stitching was off a little bit. I didn't need to worry about it with this serpentine stitch. So you could use a decorative stitch as well. On the inside, again, everything is nicely finished. So how beautiful is that? And again, because we folded under that raw edge earlier, then everything is, there's no raveling. So that's all finished. So to put this cuff around your pants is really quite simple. Now, if you are doing the cuff option, the first thing you need to do, which I mentioned earlier way back in our prep video, if you're going to do the cuff option, you actually need to cut off your hem allowance. In the pajama pattern, there is a 1-inch hem allowance already built into your pattern. But if you're going to do the cuff option, you might as well just remove that 1 inch and cut it off. So you'll end up with like your little hem allowance here. Normally, again, for our regular pajamas, we'd be folding this up and finishing that edge. But because we're going to wrap this cuff around this hem edge, we don't need this extra little bit of fabric. So just trim off your 1-inch hem allowance and get rid of it. Oh, I'll do like Eleanor Burns, throw over my shoulder. And then this raw edge here, again, we're going to, I like starting with my inseam. So then that gives me a good reference. And again, if you finished your seam allowances separately, you would have, you could already press these, open so they lay nice and flat. And then your cuff, I'm again going to find the inseam. So then we're going to match those together. And then literally, I'm just going to, might be easier for you to open your cuff, because I'm going to insert this. So where we have the fold of our cuff as we folded it in half, you want your hem edge to match that fold of your cuff. And then you want your inseam of your pajama pants to match the inseam of your cuff. And I can feel it on the inside, or again, you may need to look inside as well, but I can feel it on the inside. So you want to match this cut edge of your hem with that fold of your cuff. So you need to adjust your fabric in order to make sure everything is laying flat with your cuff. So again, I've got, here is my inseam of my pajama pants, here is the inseam of my cuff. So as we are pinning this into place, we want to make sure that, again, the cut edge of our pants is in line with that fold line of our cuff. And I can feel on the inside that that folded edge that we had created earlier is still folded under, and that's what I'm pinning into here. So if you need to, again, you can feel with your hands. I've got the pajama pants, again, up around my hand. If you need to peek through the other end to make sure that your seam is still, folded over, by all means do that. But it's a really, really fun thing to do. So again, make sure that those all the way down. And then once it's in place, again, take your pin to hold it. You definitely want to pin on the right side, facing you, because then when you sew this, you don't want to, trap your pins at all. So make sure that the pins are up at you. So once you feel you have enough pins in place, again, my edge is along that fold, then let's go back to our inseam here. Then you're going to fold this cuff back up so that raw edge of your pajama pants is completely covered, but you want that hem, that hem allowance there to stay nice and flat. So we're going to fold this cuff up along that fold, and we're going to make sure to fold this piping strip down, and then take a little look-see inside. Yes, it looks good. And then we're going to take another pin. So this you'll definitely need to spend a little bit of time, but it definitely makes a big difference. Again, it's a cute little detail. If you feel like, oh, maybe this is a little too much, start with your regular pajama pants. Again, these are so fun, so addicting to make. So start with your very first pair of the regular pajama pants. And then after you're comfortable with the pattern, you're comfortable with your machine, especially if you're a new sewer, then yes, do the regular pattern first, and then you graduate up to this cuff technique. So here, again, I've got that fold of my piping there, and I'm pinning right up to that fold so everything stays nice and flat. My cuff here, the fabric underneath it of my pajama pants is nice and flat. So you just take as much time as you need to get it all in line. These couple of extra minutes, you're really going to appreciate spending those little extra minutes to make sure everything stays nice and flat, so then you can get it all pinned in place. So I'm just going to start sewing back at this beginning part to not take too much time. So again, if you have a free arm machine, perfect time to use it. But if you don't, not a problem, because again, everything is nicely pinned in place. I just want to make sure no fabric is underneath. Now you decide, do you want to do this with a straight stitch, or do you want to do, I decided to do a decorative stitch. So if you're going to use a straight stitch, you've got a couple of different options. You could perhaps stitch right in the well of that seam, so like you're stitching in the ditch. Perhaps with your machine you have such a foot, like a stitch in the ditch foot, that will help make that easier. Or maybe you're going to move your needle over maybe about 1/8 of an inch, or maybe even 1/4 of an inch. Or maybe you're going to sew then up along this line here, maybe about 1/8 of an inch from the top edge of the piping. So the choice is entirely up to you. I'm going to do a decorative stitch right down, I think, oh, on my sample I did it right down along the fabric edge, but maybe you want to do a decorative stitch right along the piping itself. So the choice is entirely up to you. So I've decided to use a decorative stitch on my machine to stitch down the cuff. I'm using a serpentine stitch. It's like an open vine stitch, so perhaps your machine has something like that. If you use a decorative stitch, you definitely don't want anything too tight or, you know, too dense, just something very loose. Again, you'd like to get these done kind of quicker and easier, and you'll be going through more layers because of those seam allowances pressed in, so it'll just feed easier if the stitch isn't so dense. Now check with your instruction manual and your little accessory box to your machine. You probably have a foot for decorative stitches. On our Janome machines, it's the F foot. It's got a little groove under the bottom of the foot to allow those decorative stitches to pass through, so you'll definitely want to put that on your machine. So I've got my foot on and ready to go. I'm going to stitch down. I'm using this red thread actually, so it's the contrast. So how great to add another little extra decorative touch. Now we definitely want to remove our pins before we get to them. Definitely don't want to sew over those. And then again, if you've got a free arm, great. This is a great time to use it. But if not, fine. I can go in and look under. Make sure everything is nice and flat though. I want to keep my layers nice and flat, not twisted. Make sure that you're keeping that edge of the piping down so it's nice and flat. And again, remove the pins as you go. So it's really quite simple to do. There we go. Make sure again, no tucks. It's worth the extra little bit of time. It really adds a nice little designer touch by adding these cuffs, and again, another way to add more fabric, so don't we all love that? So again, how cute is that? A nice big open wave, you know, right down the middle of that piping, so it looks beautiful on the right side with that extra bit of extra thread color, but there on your backside. Now see, wasn't it worth taking that little bit of extra time, making sure everything was pressed accurately, making sure everything was pinned accurately? So again, if this is maybe a little too much as a beginner, start with the regular pattern, the regular hem, but then when you make these more, because you definitely will, they're very fun to make, then this is then the pattern that you can try to improve your skills. So isn't that great? So super simple to do. Now, a little tip, when you get here to your side seam, particularly if you do your stitching more like down here, if it's more like stitch in the ditch, you don't want this top edge of the piping, you know, flipping around. So just in the side seam, you can do a little tacking stitch, which I've done here on these samples. And especially if you use, you know, matching thread, I purposely used my contrasting thread so you'd see it, but all I did was stitch right here in that, the well of that seam, just to hold, again, right along the inseam, not the side seam, sorry, the inseam, that I stitched it down. So that way that's gonna hold the piping, because I did my decorative stitch below the piping here. So then that top edge of the piping again, oh, I don't want it to flop all over the place. So I just sewed it in a little bit there at the side seam, or sorry, at the inseam, but you could, you know, also sew it in another place here at the side if you wish, but that just tacks it in place and holds it in place a little better. So it's a fun, again, a beautiful element, a nice designer touch to your walk the plank patterns for pirates pajama pants. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's been absolutely fun. Of course, I'll be available for questions. And of course, you can always ask questions in the homemade Facebook group as well. But I'll be available to answer any questions you have. It's a very fun, easy pattern to make. I hope you've had fun. Thanks for joining me. Happy sewing.